Single dad rescues a woman after a crash. He doesn't know she owns the company that rejected him. The rain came down like the sky itself was grieving. Marcus Hale had been driving home from another failed job interview, his suit jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat, the same jacket he'd ironed 3 times that morning because he wanted to look perfect, because he needed this one to work, when he saw the silver van skidded sideways across the wet asphalt, its front end crumpled against the guardrail, one door hanging open like a broken wing. He almost drove past. He was exhausted, humiliated, and had exactly $11 in his wallet. But something in his chest pulled him toward the wreckage the way a tide pulls toward shore, slow and inevitable and impossible to fight. He didn't know it yet, but that pull was about to change everything. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that life has a way of bringing the right people together at exactly the right moment, like this video, drop a comment below, share this story, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. We tell stories that remind the world that goodness still exists. Now let's get back to Marcus. Marcus was 34 years old and had been carrying the weight of 2 people's lives on his shoulders for the past 3 years, ever since his wife Elena passed away from a sudden illness, leaving him alone with their 6-year-old son, Noah. Noah, who still slept with his mother's cardigan folded under his pillow. Noah, who asked every single night whether stars were just holes in the sky where people who loved you were peeking through. Marcus had no good answer for that. He had no good answers for much anymore. He'd been laid off from his engineering position 8 months prior when the firm downsized, and since then he'd sent out over 200 applications, attended 16 interviews, and been rejected every single time. The most recent rejection had come just that afternoon, a crisp, corporate email from Ardent Solutions, one of the most respected tech firms in the region, informing him that they had decided to move forward with other candidates. He'd read that email sitting in his car in the parking garage, and he hadn't cried. He was past crying. He'd simply driven out into the storm like a man who had forgotten what direction home was. That was when he saw the van. He pulled over without thinking, threw on his hazard lights, and ran through the sheets of rain toward the wreckage. The thunder rolled overhead like something enormous shifting in its sleep, and lightning split the sky in 2 brilliant, terrifying forks. The ground was slick beneath his dress shoes, and he nearly fell twice before reaching the vehicle. Through the shattered side window, he could see a woman slumped against the interior of the car door, half inside and half out, her white blouse torn and stained red at the shoulder, a deep gash running from her temple down toward her cheekbone, her wet hair plastered across her pale face. She was breathing, he could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest, but her eyes were glassy and distant, the way eyes look when a person is right at the edge of somewhere very dark. Marcus didn't hesitate. He reached in, checked her neck for stability the way he vaguely remembered from a first aid course he'd taken a decade ago, and then carefully, eased her out of the wreckage and onto the wet asphalt, cradling her against his chest to keep her upright. She was lighter than he expected and heavier than anything he'd ever carried, because she was a living, breathing person whose life was hanging by a thread in the middle of a storm on an empty road, and somehow that weight transferred itself entirely onto him. He pulled off his suit jacket, the jacket he'd ironed 3 times, and wrapped it around her shoulders without a second thought. Then he called 911, gave them the mile marker, and sat down on the cold wet ground with her, holding her steady, talking to her in a low, calm voice the way he talked to Noah during thunderstorms, telling her she was going to be okay, that help was coming, that she just needed to hold on a little longer. Her eyes found his face. She said something he couldn't quite hear over the rain and the thunder, something that might have been thank you or please or simply a sound that meant she was still there, still fighting. He held her tighter and kept talking. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. The paramedics took over with swift, practiced efficiency, and as they loaded her onto the stretcher, one of them told Marcus she was lucky, the wound on her head had bled significantly, and she'd likely been moments away from losing consciousness completely. Another 10 minutes alone in that storm and the outcome might have been very different. Marcus stood in the rain and watched the ambulance disappear around the bend, and then he stood there a little longer, alone on the side of the road in his soaked dress shirt, his ruined shoes, his absent jacket, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like he'd done the one right thing on an otherwise crushing day. It wasn't much. But it was something. He didn't know her name. He hadn't thought to ask. He drove home, changed his clothes, heated up the leftover pasta he'd made for Noah 2 nights before, and sat at the kitchen table while his son slept, staring at nothing in particular, thinking about the way she'd looked at him right before the paramedics arrived, grateful and frightened and deeply, completely human. 3 weeks later, Marcus received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Claire Ardent. The name didn't register immediately. She told him she was calling to thank him personally, that she had spent 4 days in the hospital recovering from a fractured collarbone and a severe concussion, that the doctors had said the warmth and stability he'd provided in those critical minutes had almost certainly prevented her from going into shock. She said she'd tracked him down through the police report he'd filed, and she hoped he didn't mind. And then she paused, and she said something that made Marcus's hand go still against the kitchen counter. She said she was the founder and CEO of Ardent Solutions. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. She broke it herself, telling him she had personally reviewed his application after learning who he was, that she had read his file thoroughly, that she couldn't understand how he had slipped through, that someone with his background and his experience, and she paused again here, and her voice shifted into something quieter and more careful. His character deserved far better than a form rejection email. She asked if he would be willing to come in. Not for an interview. For a conversation. Marcus sat down slowly. Through the doorway he could see Noah's drawings taped to the refrigerator, lopsided stars and crayon suns, and one drawing labeled "Daddy and Me" in uneven letters. He thought about Elena. He thought about $11 in a wallet. He thought about a storm and a woman on cold asphalt and a jacket he'd never see again. He thought about how sometimes the worst days of your life and the best days of your life arrive wearing exactly the same clothes, and you can't tell them apart until much later, when you're standing on the other side of them, looking back. He told Claire Ardent that yes, he would be willing to come in. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that a single act of kindness can rewrite someone's entire story, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Before we go, drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever done something kind for a stranger without expecting anything in return? We read every single one. Marcus showed up to Ardent Solutions the following Tuesday in a new jacket he'd bought from a thrift store for $6. He walked through those glass doors not as a desperate man chasing a lifeline, but as someone who had already proven, in the rain and the lightning on the side of a dark road, exactly who he was. And sometimes, that is more than enough.